Sometimes the hardest thing in life is finding your way back home. Even harder is rebuilding what you broke along the way. Russell Crane stood in front of the abandoned house on Maple Lane, the place everyone said was too far gone to save. At 48, he'd come back to his hometown with nothing but regrets and a duffel bag. The old wooden house was covered in vines, its porch sagging under years of neglect. Neighbors warned him to stay away, but Russell had been a carpenter once, and he saw something beneath the rot, a chance to start over. With salvaged wood and his own 2 hands, he started fixing the house board by board. What he didn't know was that fixing the house might also fix what mattered most. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bus had dropped Russell Crane at the edge of Millhaven just after dawn, when the October mist still clung to the valley like a held breath. He stood on the cracked sidewalk with his duffel bag at his feet, watching the taillights disappear around the bend. 25 years. That's how long it had been since he'd last stood on this street, since he'd felt the particular weight of this mountain air in his lungs. The town looked smaller than he remembered, the way childhood places always do. Main Street stretched out before him, lined with the same brick buildings that had been there since his grandfather's time. Some storefronts had changed hands. The old Five and Dime was now a coffee shop, the movie theater had become an antique store, but the bones remained the same. Millhaven had always been the kind of place where things moved slowly, where people measured time in seasons rather than hours. Russell adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder and started walking. His boots made hollow sounds on the sidewalk, each step carrying him deeper into a past he'd spent decades trying to outrun. He'd left this town at 23, full of restless ambition, and convinced that somewhere out there was a life bigger and brighter than the one his father had lived. He'd been wrong about a lot of things back then. The hardware store was just opening when he passed. Through the window, he could see Bert Lawson arranging paint cans in a display. Bert had aged. His hair had gone completely white, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose knees had logged too many years on hard floors. Russell kept his head down and kept walking. He wasn't ready for conversations yet, wasn't ready to explain why he'd come back or what he planned to do. Maple Lane sat at the eastern edge of town, where the houses grew farther apart and the woods began to press in close. Russell had walked this route 1,000 times as a boy, knew every crack in the sidewalk, every oak tree that lined the street. But he'd never walked it with this particular heaviness in his chest, this mixture of hope and dread that made his hands shake. The house appeared through the trees like something from a half-forgotten dream. Number 42, the last house on the lane, set back from the road behind a rusted iron gate that hung crooked on its hinges. Russell stopped at the gate and just looked. It was worse than he'd imagined. The 2-story colonial structure sagged in the middle, like an old horse, swayed with age. Ivy covered the left side completely, thick ropes of it that had worked their way under the siding and into the window frames. The porch tilted at an angle that defied gravity, its railing broken in 3 places. Several windows were boarded up. Others had simply given in to time, their glass broken or missing entirely. The roof showed patches of blue tarp, where someone, probably the county, had made half-hearted attempts to keep the weather out. The front yard was a wilderness, waist-high grass mixed with brambles and wild roses that had long since forgotten they'd ever been cultivated. A oak tree that Russell remembered as barely taller than himself now towered over the house, its branches scraping the roof with every breath of wind. But underneath the decay, Russell could see the house his grandfather had built. The solid frame, the careful proportions, the wide porch that was meant for sitting on summer evenings with a glass of sweet tea. The bones were good. That's what his father would have said. The bones are good, the rest is just work. Russell pushed through the gate, leaving it hanging open behind him. The path to the front door was barely visible, more memory than reality. Blackberry vines caught at his jeans as he made his way forward. When he reached the porch steps, he tested them carefully before putting his full weight down. The wood groaned but held. The front door was locked, but the key had been waiting for him at the county clerk's office, along with a stack of papers about back taxes and liens that Russell had signed away most of his savings to clear. He worked the key into the lock, felt the old mechanism resist, then give. The door swung inward with a sound like a sigh. The smell hit him first. Mildew and rot and the particular mustiness of a place that hadn't felt human warmth in too long. But underneath that, something else. The ghost of wood smoke. The memory of his grandmother's lavender sachets. The past, trapped in the walls like something living. Russell stepped inside and let his eyes adjust to the dimness. The front hall stretched before him, narrower than he remembered. The wallpaper, cabbage roses on a cream background, hung in strips revealing water-stained plaster beneath. To his left, the living room with its river-stone fireplace. To his right, the dining room where his family had gathered for Sunday suppers. Straight ahead, stairs leading up to the second floor, each step covered in a thick layer of dust that showed no footprints but his own. He moved through the house slowly, cataloguing the damage with a carpenter's eye. Water damage in the back bedroom extensive. Foundation settling in the northeast corner. Electrical would need to be completely redone. Plumbing was probably shot. The kitchen cabinets had given up entirely, hanging at odd angles or collapsed on the floor. Every surface was coated in the grime of abandonment, but the hardwood floors were oak, solid and thick. The trim work was hand-carved, the kind of craftsmanship nobody did anymore. The fireplace was river stone, each one chosen and placed by his grandfather's hands. The windows, where they remained, were old-growth glass that bent light in ways modern windows never could. Russell climbed the stairs, testing each one. In the upstairs hallway, he found himself standing in front of what had been his childhood bedroom. The door hung crooked, but when he pushed it open, the small room looked almost untouched. The same blue wallpaper faded now, the same window looking out over the backyard and the woods beyond. He set his duffel bag down on the floor. Dust rose up in a cloud, caught in the shaft of sunlight coming through the window. This would do for now. He had a sleeping bag in the duffel, a change of clothes, a few tools, not much else. Everything he owned in the world fit in one bag. That was either pathetic or liberating, and Russell hadn't decided which yet. From his pocket he pulled out his phone. No missed calls. He hadn't expected any, but the disappointment still settled in his chest like a stone. He pulled up his contacts, scrolled to a name he'd looked at 1,000 times, but never called. Nolan. His son, 27 years old now. A man Russell barely knew anymore. His thumb hovered over the call button. What would he even say? After 5 years of silence, what words could possibly be enough? Russell locked the phone and put it away. Not yet. First, he had to prove something. First, he had to show that this time was different, that he wasn't going to disappear again. He went back downstairs and out to the porch. The afternoon sun was starting to slant through the trees, painting everything gold. Russell sat down on the top step, careful to choose a spot that looked solid, and surveyed his new domain. An elderly woman was walking down the street with a small dog on a leash. She slowed when she saw him, stopped at the gate. She wore a cardigan despite the mild weather, and had the kind of face that had smiled so much it had set in pleasant lines. "You must be the Crane boy," she called out. Russell stood up, wiped his dusty hands on his jeans. "Yes, ma'am." "Russell Crane. I'm Dorothy Pemberton. I live 3 houses down. Used to bring you lemonade when you were small and working in your grandfather's garden." She studied him with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You planning to do something with this old place?" "Yes, ma'am. Planning to fix it up." Mrs. Pemberton looked at the house, then back at Russell. Her expression was kind but skeptical. "That's a lot of work for one person." "I've got time," Russell said. She nodded slowly. "Well, welcome home then. If you need anything, you know where to find me." 3 houses down, the yellow one with the blue shutters. Russell watched her walk away, her little dog trotting beside her. "Welcome home." The word sat strangely in his ears. This wasn't home, not anymore. Home was something you earned, something you built. Right now, this was just a broken house at the end of a forgotten street. But it was a start. Russell spent his first week learning the house's secrets, Every morning, he woke at dawn on the sleeping bag he'd spread across the bedroom floor, his back aching from the hard surface. He'd make instant coffee with water from the jug he kept refilled at Mrs. Pemberton's outdoor spigot, and then he'd walk through the rooms with a notebook, documenting every crack, every soft spot, every place where rot had taken hold. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Measure, note, plan. It was the kind of work his father had taught him to do before touching a single tool. "A house will tell you what it needs," his father used to say. "You just have to know how to listen." On the 8th day, Russell started on the living room. The wallpaper had to come down first. It was holding moisture against the plaster, creating the perfect environment for mold. He worked with a scraper and a spray bottle, wetting small sections and peeling away the layers. The cabbage roses came away in long strips, revealing decades of other patterns beneath. Someone had put up this paper over at least 3 previous layers. He was working on the wall behind, where a bookshelf had once stood, when his scraper hit something that didn't feel like plaster. Russell stopped, sprayed more water, and carefully worked around the edges. A corner of something dark appeared beneath the final layer of paper. His hands moved faster now, peeling away the soggy paper to reveal a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The glass was intact, the image behind it protected from the moisture by some miracle of positioning. Russell lifted it carefully from where it had been tucked behind a gap in the plaster, probably knocked loose when the bookshelf was removed and inadvertently papered over. He carried it to the window where the light was better. The photograph showed a boy of maybe 8 or 9 standing on this very porch with a man in his 40s. The man had his hand on the boy's shoulder, both of them smiling at the camera. The boy wore overalls and had a gap where his front teeth should be. The man wore work clothes, a carpenter's apron still strapped around his waist. Russell's throat went tight. He knew these people. The boy was him. The man was his father, Charles Crane. And behind them, the house looked perfect, freshly painted, the porch level, flowers blooming in boxes beneath the windows. He sank down onto the dusty floor, still holding the photograph. His father had been 43 in this picture, just 5 years younger than Russell was now. He'd seemed so much older then, so much more capable and sure of himself. Russell had worshipped him, had followed him around like a shadow, had absorbed every lesson about wood and nails and the satisfaction of building something that would outlast you. "Measure twice, cut once," his father would say. "Build it right the first time and it'll stand for 100 years. Russell had measured twice in his carpentry work. But in his life, he'd cut without measuring at all. He'd married young to a woman named Diane, had a son before he was ready, had panicked at the weight of responsibility and started finding reasons to work late, to take jobs in other towns, to be anywhere but home. The drinking had started as a way to quiet the voice in his head that said he was failing, that he wasn't half the man his father had been. By the time Nolan was 10, Russell was barely present. By the time Nolan was 15, Russell and Diane had divorced. By the time Nolan was 22, Russell had missed his college graduation because he'd been 3 states away on a construction job he couldn't even remember now. The last time Russell had seen his son was 5 years ago. Nolan had driven down to the apartment Russell was renting in Sacramento, had sat across from him at a cheap diner, and had said the words that still woke Russell up at night. "I can't do this anymore, Dad. I can't keep hoping you'll show up and then watching you disappear. I'm done." Russell had wanted to argue, to promise he'd change, to beg for another chance. But he'd seen the exhaustion in his son's eyes, the kind of weariness that comes from giving someone too many chances already. So he'd just nodded and watched Nolan walk away. That had been Russell's bottom. He'd quit drinking the next day, started going to meetings, started trying to put his life back together. But knowing how to fix yourself and knowing how to fix what you'd broken with someone else, those were different skills entirely. Russell set the photograph carefully on the mantel above the fireplace. His father stared out at him, frozen in a moment of pride and possibility. What would he think of Russell now? Would he be disappointed at how far his son had fallen? Or would he see this, the return, the commitment to restore what had been abandoned, as a kind of redemption? His phone buzzed in his pocket. Russell pulled it out, half hoping, but it was just a notification from the hardware store about a sale on exterior paint. Not Nolan, never Nolan. But then Russell remembered something Mrs. Pemberton had said yesterday when she'd brought over a container of vegetable soup. She'd been standing in the front hall, looking around at the exposed plaster and dangling wires, and she'd mentioned almost casually, "Your boy called me a few months back, you know. Asked if I knew where you were." Russell had frozen. "Nolan called you?" "He did. Got my number somehow. Probably from the church directory. Asked if I'd heard from you, if anyone in town knew how to reach you." Mrs. Pemberton had studied him with those sharp eyes. "I told him I hadn't heard from you in over 20 years. He seemed disappointed. Did he say why he was looking?" "No. But a son doesn't track down his father's old neighbors unless something in him wants to reach out." She'd patted Russell's arm. "Just thought you should know." Russell had spent that whole night thinking about it. Nolan had been looking for him, maybe not to reconcile, but at least to know where he was. That meant something. That meant the door wasn't completely closed. Now, standing in the wreckage of this old house with the photograph of his father in his hands, Russell made a decision. He pulled out his phone and navigated to his contacts. Under Nolan's name was an email address that Diane had given him years ago. Nolan's work email at the architectural firm where he worked in Portland. Russell opened a new message and started, typing with clumsy thumbs, "Nolan, I don't expect you to respond to this. I just wanted you to know I'm in Millhaven, at Grandpa's old house on Maple Lane. I'm fixing it up. I know that probably doesn't mean much to you, and I understand why. I just thought you should know where I am. I'm staying this time. I'm not going anywhere. Love, Dad." He read it over 3 times, then hit send before he could talk himself out of it. The message disappeared into the digital void. Russell had no idea if Nolan would even open it, let alone respond, but he'd done what he could. He looked around the living room with fresh eyes. The house suddenly felt less like a renovation project and more like a promise. Every board he replaced, every wall he repaired, every hour he invested. It was all evidence, proof that he could commit to something, that he could see something through to completion. Russell picked up his scraper and went back to work. The wallpaper came away easier now, as if the house was finally ready to shed its old skin and show him what lay beneath. By the time the sun set, he'd cleared 3 walls down to the studs. He stood in the empty room as darkness gathered outside. The photograph on the mantel caught the last of the light, his father's hand on his young shoulder, the house perfect behind them. "I'm going to make it right," Russell said to the empty room. To his father's memory, to himself, whatever it takes. The foundation work began on a Monday morning when the air smelled of rain, but the sky remained stubbornly clear. Russell had spent the weekend reading old carpentry manuals and watching tutorial videos on his phone, relearning skills that had gone rusty from disuse. Foundation repair wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. Everything else depended on getting this right. He started at the northeast corner, where the settling was worst. The crawl space was barely 3 feet high, forcing him to work on his belly with a headlamp strapped to his forehead. The earth was damp and smelled of clay. Above him, the floor joists showed signs of water damage and insect activity, but the main support beams were solid oak, thick as a man's thigh. The physical labor felt good. His muscles ached in ways they hadn't in years, and by the end of each day, he was too exhausted to do anything but eat a simple meal and collapse into his sleeping bag. The exhaustion was a blessing. It kept the thoughts at bay, kept him from checking his phone every 5 minutes to see if Nolan had responded. He hadn't. 4 days had passed since Russell sent the email, and there had been no reply. Russell told himself this was expected, that 5 years of silence couldn't be bridged with a single message. But hope was a stubborn thing, and it kept flickering in his chest, despite his best efforts to smother it. On Thursday, Russell was measuring lumber behind the house when he heard footsteps on the porch. He came around the side to find a man in his 60s, examining the foundation work with an appraising eye. The man wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt, and his face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. "Bert Lawson," the man said, extending a hand, "from the hardware store. Heard you were out here working." Russell shook his hand. "Russell Crane. Appreciate you coming by. Wanted to see what you were up to. This old place has been sitting empty a long time." Bert walked around the corner, crouched down to look at the new supports Russell had installed. "Good work. Using pressure-treated?" "Yes, sir." "And concrete footings?" Bert nodded approval. "Your grandfather built this house in 1952. Did most of the work himself, with some help from friends. It was something back then. Only two-story house on this end of town." He straightened up, his knees popping. He'd be glad to see someone taking care of it again. Russell felt something loosen in his chest. "I'm doing my best." "I can see that." Bert pulled a business card from his pocket. "Come by the store when you need supplies. I'll extend you credit. Pay when you can. I know the county took most of what you had just to clear the title." Russell stared at the card. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Bert's expression was kind but firm. "This town takes care of its own, Russell. You're a Crane, and the Cranes have been part of Millhaven since the beginning. Besides, I remember when you were a boy following your father around. Good kid, polite, hard-working." He paused. "Whatever happened after you left, that's your business. What matters is you're here now, and you're doing honest work." After Bert left, Russell sat on the porch steps for a long time, turning the business card over in his hands. The kindness felt undeserved, and that made it both precious and painful. He'd spent so many years running from this town, from these memories, convinced that he'd failed too badly to ever come back. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe home wasn't something you had to earn. Maybe it was something that waited for you to be ready to accept it. The weekend brought cooler weather and the first real rain Russell had seen since arriving. He used the time to work inside, removing the rest of the damaged wallpaper and beginning to assess what could be salvaged and what needed to be replaced. The house revealed itself slowly, layer by layer, like a story being told backwards. On Sunday afternoon, Russell climbed into the attic to check the roof decking. The space was low and hot, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. Light came through gaps in the roof where shingles had blown away, creating shafts of gold in the dimness. He worked his way across the joists carefully, testing each section of decking, marking the damaged areas with chalk. In the far corner, beneath a pile of old blankets and forgotten boxes, Russell found a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. It was well made, crafted from cherry wood with dovetail joints at the corners. The lid was held shut with a simple brass clasp, green with age. Russell carried it down to his room and set it on the floor where the light was better. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the clasp. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, were letters. Dozens of them, in envelopes that had never been mailed. All addressed to the same person, Nolan Crane. Russell's breath caught. He recognized his own handwriting, younger and less careful than it was now. These were letters he'd written years ago, maybe a decade ago, in various apartments and motel rooms during his drinking years. Letters he'd composed in moments of clarity or remorse, letters he'd sealed and addressed, but never found the courage to send. He opened the first one with shaking hands. "Dear Nolan, I know I missed your birthday again. I know sorry doesn't mean much anymore, but I am. I think about you every day. I wonder if you still like basketball, if you're still good at math, if you still make that face when you're concentrating on something hard. I wish I could be there to see who you're becoming. Love, Dad." Russell opened another. "Dear Nolan, your mother told me you made the honor roll. I'm so proud of you. You're smart like she is, thank God. I hope you know that even though I'm not there, I'm cheering for you. I'm always cheering for you, even from a distance. Love, Dad." And another, "Dear Nolan, I heard you graduated high school. I should have been there. I wanted to be there. I'm sorry. I'm always sorry. That's all I ever am anymore, sorry and absent. You deserve better than that. You deserve a father who shows up, I don't know how to be that person, but I'm trying to figure it out. Love, Dad." There were 23 letters in total, spanning what looked like 7 or 8 years. Russell read each one, and with each one, the weight in his chest grew heavier. These were the words of a man who knew he was failing, who wanted desperately to do better, but who couldn't quite find the strength to bridge the gap between wanting and doing. He'd written these letters, sealed them, addressed them, and then hidden them away in this box instead of mailing them. Even in his moments of clarity, he'd been a coward. Russell sat with the letters spread around him on the floor as the afternoon faded into evening. Rain drummed steadily on the roof, finding its way through the damaged sections to drip into the buckets he'd placed strategically around the attic. The sound was rhythmic, almost soothing. These letters were evidence of his failure, but they were also evidence of something else. That even at his lowest, even when he was drowning in bottles and self-pity, some part of him had still loved his son, had still wanted to reach out, to explain, to apologize. Maybe that counted for something. Maybe not. But Russell carefully placed all the letters back in the box and carried it downstairs. He set it on the mantel next to the photograph of himself and his father. 2 artifacts now. 2 pieces of evidence that love, however imperfectly expressed, had always been there beneath the wreckage. October gave way to November, and the work continued. Russell fell into a rhythm that felt almost like meditation. Wake before dawn, work until the light failed, fall into exhausted sleep, and repeat. His hands grew calloused again, his muscles remembering the language of physical labor. The house responded to his attention like something waking from a long sleep. Kyle Pemberton started showing up on Saturday mornings. He was Mrs. Pemberton's grandson, a quiet young man of 19 with careful hands and a willingness to learn. Russell hadn't asked for help, but Kyle appeared one weekend with work gloves and a thermos of coffee, and Russell found he was grateful for the company. They worked side by side, replacing the rotted floorboards in the dining room. Kyle had questions about everything. Why this type of wood? Why this particular spacing? Why measure from this direction instead of that one? Russell answered each question patiently, and in the answering, he realized he was passing on the same lessons his father had taught him. "My grandma says you used to be really good at this," Kyle said, fitting a board into place. "Long time ago," Russell replied. "What made you stop?" Russell was quiet for a moment, considering how much truth to share. "I got lost for a while. Made some poor choices. Forgot what mattered." Kyle nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "But you're back now." "I'm back now," Russell agreed. They worked in comfortable silence after that, the sound of hammers and saws filling the space where words might have been. Russell found himself thinking that this was what he'd missed most during his years of wandering. Not just the work itself, but the sense of building something that would last, of creating rather than destroying. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, Russell was clearing the overgrown yard when his shovel hit something solid beneath the tangle of weeds and fallen leaves. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt to reveal a piece of metal, green with age. He worked it free from the earth and held it up to the light. It was a compass, the kind that opened like a pocket watch. The brass casing was badly tarnished, but when Russell pried it open, the needle inside still swung true. On the inside of the lid, engraved in letters he could barely make out, were the words, "True North, Dad." Russell's heart stopped. He remembered this compass. He'd bought it at an outdoor store when Nolan was 8 years old, had it engraved, and given it to his son for his birthday. Nolan had been fascinated by it, had carried it everywhere for months. Russell had told him, "Keep this with you, and you'll always be able to find your way home." The irony was almost unbearable. Russell had given his son a tool for finding home, and then Russell himself had become the one who was lost. How had the compass ended up buried in this yard? Nolan had been here, must have been here at some point. Maybe visiting his great-grandfather before the old man passed. Maybe the compass had fallen from a pocket, been lost in the grass, buried by time and weather. Russell closed the compass carefully and slipped it into his pocket. The metal was cold against his leg, a small weight that felt significant. He would keep it safe. Maybe someday he'd have the chance to return it. Maybe not. But either way, he'd hold on to it. That evening, Russell walked into town for the first time since arriving. The main street was quiet, most shops already closed for the day. But the sheriff's office had lights on, and through the window, Russell could see a man in uniform working at a desk. Sheriff Garrett Macklin looked up when Russell knocked. Recognition dawned slowly, then broke into a broad smile. He came to the door and held it open. "Russell Crane, I heard you were back in town." "Hello, Garrett." Russell shook his hand. They'd been friends once, had played on the same baseball team in high school. Garrett had stayed in Millhaven, had married his high school sweetheart, had built a life here. All the things Russell had run from. "Come in, sit down. Coffee?" They sat in the small office, drinking coffee from chipped mugs, and talked about the years that had passed. Garrett didn't ask about where Russell had been or what had brought him back. Instead, he talked about the town, about people they'd both known, about his own children who were grown now with kids of their own. "I made a lot of mistakes," Garrett said at one point, his voice thoughtful. "Early on especially. I was drinking too much, taking my frustrations out on my wife. Almost lost everything that mattered." He looked at Russell directly. "But I got help. Made changes. Been sober 16 years now." Russell felt something shift in his chest. "I'm 2 years sober." "Well, 2 years and 4 months, Garrett nodded. "It's hard work. Every day is hard work. But it's worth it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding between them. Then Garrett said, "I looked up your son. Professional curiosity, I guess. Nolan Crane, architect in Portland. Pretty successful from what I can see. Works for a big firm doing commercial projects." Russell's throat tightened. "You looked him up?" "I did. He's done well for himself." Garrett paused. "He asked about you, you know. Called me about 6 months ago. Wanted to know if anyone in town had heard from you, if we knew where you were." Russell leaned forward. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I hadn't heard anything. But I also told him that if you ever did come back, you'd probably end up at that old house." Garrett smiled slightly. "I know you, Russell. Even back in high school, when things got tough, you always wanted to fix something with your hands. I figured if you came home, you'd come home to work." Russell pulled the compass from his pocket and showed it to Garrett. "Found this buried in the yard today." Garrett examined it, read the inscription. "He was here then. Your grandfather probably brought him to visit before he passed. He kept it all these years, carried it until he lost it. Maybe he kept it because it meant something," Garrett said quietly. "Maybe it still does." Russell took the compass back and turned it over in his hands. The needle swung steadily, pointing north. True north, the way home. "I sent him an email," Russell said. "Told him where I was. He hasn't responded. Give him time. 5 years of silence is a lot to overcome. But the fact that he was looking for you, that means something." Garrett refilled their coffee cups. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep showing up. Keep working. Sometimes that's all we can do, prove through our actions that we've changed." Russell walked back to the house as full darkness settled over the town. The compass was heavy in his pocket, a small piece of his son carried close to his heart. When he reached Maple Lane, he could see the dark outline of the house against the stars. No lights, no warmth yet, but it was standing. It was waiting. He climbed the porch steps and went inside. Tomorrow he would start on the back bedroom, the one with the extensive water damage. It would be hard work, slow work, but he had time. He had nothing but time and a house that needed him, and a compass pointing toward a son who might someday find his way home. Winter arrived early that year, bringing frost that turned the world silver, and mornings so cold Russell could see his breath inside the house. He'd managed to get the back bedroom gutted before the weather turned, all the damaged drywall removed, the studs exposed and treated for mold. Now he was rebuilding, one wall at a time, working in layers of insulation and vapor barrier before the new drywall went up. The work was slower in the cold. His fingers grew stiff, and he had to stop frequently to warm his hands over the small electric heater he'd bought at Bert's store. But the progress was visible now. The house was transforming, shedding its decay like a snake sheds old skin. On a grey December morning, Russell was measuring new drywall sheets when he noticed something on the hallway doorframe. He'd been meaning to replace this frame. It was scarred and battered from decades of use. But now, looking closer, he realized the marks weren't random damage. They were pencil lines, each one labeled with a date and a height measurement. Russell set down his measuring tape and examined the markings more carefully. The earliest one was dated 1956, marked Russell, age 3, 34 inches. Above it, climbing up the frame in irregular increments, were more lines. Russell, age 5, 40 inches. Russell, age 7, 46 inches. The marks continued up to Russell, age 12, 58 inches, and then they stopped. He traced the lines with his finger, remembering. His grandfather had measured him here every birthday, marking his growth with careful precision. Russell could almost hear the old man's voice. "Stand up straight now. No cheating. Let's see how much you've grown." The doorframe was a record of his childhood, a physical documentation of time passing. And it ended at age 12, because that was the year his grandfather died, the year the house started its long slide into abandonment. Russell sat down on the floor in the hallway, his back against the wall, and looked at the growth chart. He was 48 years old now. His own son was 27. Where were Nolan's growth marks? Russell had missed them all. He hadn't been there to measure, to mark, to witness his son growing taller, growing up, growing away. The weight of lost time pressed down on him like something physical. All those years, all those moments, birthdays and school plays and baseball games and graduations, gone. You couldn't get them back. You couldn't rebuild lost time the way you could rebuild a wall. Mrs. Pemberton found him there an hour later, still sitting on the floor, staring at the pencil marks. She'd brought soup again, this time with fresh bread wrapped in a kitchen towel. She set the basket down and lowered herself carefully to sit beside him on the floor, her old bones creaking with the effort. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said, following his gaze to the doorframe. "Proud of you. Always talking about what you'd build when you grew up." "I disappointed him," Russell said quietly. "Maybe, or maybe he'd understand better than you think." Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. "My husband was an alcoholic. 20 years he struggled with it. Couldn't hold a job, couldn't keep promises. He'd disappear for days at a time, and I'd sit up waiting, not knowing if he was dead or alive." Russell looked at her in surprise. He'd never known this about the Pembertons. "He got sober when our daughter was 15, she continued. "Stayed sober until the day he died 32 years later. Those last 32 years, he was the man I'd always known he could be. Kind, present, reliable." She patted Russell's hand. "The first 20 years were hard, but the last 32 made up for them. Time has a way of balancing out, if you give it enough of it. I don't know if my son will give me that time," Russell said. "Maybe he will, maybe he won't, but that's not really the point, is it?" Mrs. Pemberton struggled to her feet, and Russell rose quickly to help her. "The point is whether you're becoming the person you want to be, whether you're doing the work. The rest is up to him." After she left, Russell carefully wrapped the doorframe in protective plastic. He'd salvage it, incorporate it into the restored house somehow. It was a record that needed to be preserved, even if, especially if, it documented his absence as much as his presence. That afternoon, he received his first piece of mail at the house, a letter forwarded from his old address in Sacramento. The return address made his hands shake. It was from Nolan's mother, Diane. Russell sat on the porch steps, the cold seeping through his jeans, and opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Diane's neat handwriting. "Russell, Nolan showed me the email you sent him. I'm writing because I think there are things you should know. Nolan has been asking about you for the past year. He won't admit it, but I can see it weighing on him. He's doing well, successful career, good friends, healthy life. But there's something unresolved there. I think he needs to see for himself that you're really changing, that you're really staying. I'm not saying he's ready to talk to you. I'm just saying he's aware you're there. Give him time. And Russell, don't disappear again. Whatever you do, don't disappear. That would be worse than never coming back at all." "Diane." Russell read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Nolan knew where he was. Nolan was aware of what he was doing. That was something. That was more than he'd had before. He pulled out his phone and composed a new email to Nolan. This one was shorter. "Nolan, I know you're not ready to talk, and I understand why. I just want you to know I'm still here. The house is coming along. I'm working on it every day. I'm not going anywhere. I hope you're doing well. I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Love, Dad." He hit send and put the phone away. Then he went back inside and returned to work. The drywall needed to be cut to precise measurements, fitted carefully around the window frame, secured with screws, spaced exactly right. It was detailed work that required focus, and Russell welcomed the distraction. Kyle arrived in the early afternoon with sandwiches from the diner in town. They ate, sitting on upturned buckets in the living room, their breath making clouds in the cold air. "My grandma says you're doing good work here," Kyle said through a mouthful of sandwich. "Trying to," Russell replied. "She also says you're doing it for your son." Russell was quiet for a moment. "I'm doing it because it needs to be done, because this house deserves better than what it got. If my son ever sees it, that would be good. But even if he doesn't, the work still matters." Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "That's pretty wise." Russell almost laughed. Wise. He'd never felt less wise in his life. But maybe that was the point. Maybe wisdom wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about doing the work anyway, even when you didn't know how it would turn out. They finished their lunch and went back to work. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the scars of the yard with temporary beauty. The snow continued through December, blanketing Millhaven in white that muffled sound and softened edges. Russell worked inside now, focused on making the house weatherproof before the real cold set in. The new windows arrived, not historic replicas, but good-quality double-paned units that would keep the heat in. Installing them was satisfying work. Watching each gap in the house's envelope seal shut, watching it become more like a home and less like a shell. In the basement, Russell found his father's old workshop mostly intact. The tools were rusted, the workbench covered in decades of dust, but the bones of it remained. And there, on a shelf above the bench, he found a mason jar filled with old nails. They were sorted by size and type, each section of the jar carefully separated. Finishing nails, framing nails, roofing nails, all organized with the kind of methodical care his father had brought to everything. Russell carried the jar upstairs and set it on the kitchen counter. He spent an evening cleaning the nails with steel wool and oil, removing the surface rust, sorting out the ones too corroded to use. It was meditative work, and as his hands moved, he thought about his father's lessons. Measure twice, cut once. How many times had he heard that? But it wasn't just about carpentry. It was about thinking before acting, about planning before committing. Russell had spent most of his adult life cutting without measuring, making decisions without thinking them through. The consequences had been predictable. Quality over speed. His father had never rushed a job, never sacrificed craftsmanship for convenience. Russell had watched him spend an entire afternoon fitting a single doorframe, adjusting and readjusting until it was perfect. At the time, Russell had thought it was excessive. Now he understood it was respect for the work, for the materials, for the people who would use what he built. A good carpenter leaves a place better than he found it. This had been his father's philosophy about everything, not just construction. Leave things better. Make improvements. Add value. Don't just take up space in the world. Russell had taken up space for a long time. Now finally, he was trying to leave something better. On a Friday evening, Sheriff Macklin stopped by with news. Russell was installing trim in the dining room when he heard the knock. He opened the door to find Garrett standing on the porch, snow dusting his uniform jacket. "Got a minute?" Garrett asked. They sat in the living room on the folding chairs Russell had bought. The space was starting to look like a room again. Walls patched and painted, the fireplace cleaned and ready for use, the original hardwood floors sanded and sealed. "I had a phone call today," Garrett said. "From your son." Russell's heart jumped. "Nolan called you?" "He did. Asked about the house, about what kind of work you were doing. Asked if you were really here, really staying." Garrett paused. "I told him what I've seen. That you're here every day. That you're putting real work into this place." that you seemed different than you were." "What did he say?" "Not much. Just thanked me and hung up. But Russell, the fact that he called means something. He's checking on you. He's paying attention." After Garrett left, Russell sat in the darkening room and thought about his son calling the sheriff's office, asking questions, trying to verify the truth of Russell's presence. It made sense. Nolan had no reason to trust words anymore. He needed evidence. He needed proof. Russell could give him that. One board at a time, one nail at a time, one day at a time. The house itself was becoming the proof. Christmas approached, and Mrs. Pemberton insisted Russell join her family for dinner. He tried to decline, didn't want to impose, didn't feel he deserved the kindness, but she wouldn't hear his protests. So on Christmas afternoon, he found himself at her table, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, including Kyle, passing dishes and listening to stories and feeling the strange, almost painful warmth of belonging. After dinner, Mrs. Pemberton pulled him aside. "I have something for you," she said, leading him to her study. From a drawer, she pulled out an old photo album. "Your grandmother gave this to me for safekeeping years ago, before she passed. She wanted someone to hold onto the family pictures in case you ever came back." Russell opened the album with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of his family spanning decades. His grandparents as young people building the house. His father as a boy, then as a young man. Russell himself at various ages. And near the back, a few photos of a young woman holding a baby, Russell holding infant Nolan, looking terrified and proud at the same time. "You were a good father once," Mrs. Pemberton said softly. "You can be again." Russell closed the album carefully. "Thank you for keeping these safe. That's what neighbors do, what family does." She patted his arm. "Now you're keeping that house safe. It's the same thing, really. Preserving what matters." The day after Christmas, Russell wrote another letter to Nolan. This one he printed out and put in an actual envelope with an actual stamp. "Nolan, I heard you called Sheriff Macklin. I understand why you need to verify that I'm really here. I would too if I were you. I'm enclosing some pictures Mrs. Pemberton had of us when you were small. I don't know if you have any photos from back then, but these are yours if you want them. The house is almost weatherproof now. I've been using Grandpa's old nails for some of the work, the ones he sorted and saved. There's something about using his materials that feels right, like I'm connecting to something that was here before me and will be here after. I hope you're having a good holiday season. I'm thinking of you. Love, Dad." He included 3 photographs, one of himself holding baby Nolan, one of toddler Nolan playing in a yard Russell didn't recognize, and one of 5-year-old Nolan grinning at the camera with a gap-toothed smile. Russell mailed the letter at the post office on Main Street. The clerk, an older woman he didn't recognize, gave him a knowing look when she saw the Portland address. "Your boy?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Long way away." "Yes, ma'am." "It is." "Well, letters have a way of traveling distance," she said, stamping the envelope. "Sometimes they can get further than we can ourselves." Russell walked back to the house, through streets lined with Christmas lights and decorated trees visible through windows. Families gathered together, warm and complete. He didn't feel jealous exactly, just aware of the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be. But he was working toward it. Every day, every hour, every careful measurement and precise cut. He was building something that might, someday, be enough to bridge that distance. Back at the house, he built his first fire in the restored fireplace. The chimney drew perfectly, pulling the smoke up and out. The warmth spread through the room, pushing back the winter cold. Russell sat on the floor in front of the fire and watched the flames dance. The nails from his father's jar, catching the light like small promises scattered across the mantel. He was staying. He was building. He was becoming someone his son might recognize, not the man he'd been, but someone better. Someone who measured twice and cut once. Someone who valued quality over speed. Someone who left things better than he found them. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, the house was warm. January brought cold so sharp it hurt to breathe, and Russell worked bundled in layers, his breath fogging the air inside the still unheated upstairs rooms. He'd gotten the downstairs livable. The fireplace provided warmth, and he'd set up a small living space in what had been the dining room. But the upstairs needed work before it could be properly heated, and that meant finishing the insulation and duct work. He was in the cellar one grey afternoon, mapping out where the new heating system would go, when his headlamp caught the edge of something metallic behind an old cabinet. Russell squeezed into the narrow space and pulled out a locked metal box about the size of a small suitcase. It was heavy, and rust had sealed the hinges partially shut. He carried it upstairs to the kitchen and worked on the lock with penetrating oil and patience. After 20 minutes, the mechanism gave way with a reluctant click. Russell opened the lid. Inside were papers, legal documents, yellowed with age but still legible. Russell spread them out on the counter, his work-roughened hands careful with the brittle pages. There was a will, dated 1998, signed by his grandfather, Charles Crane Sr. There were property tax records, and there, beneath everything else, was a deed. Russell's hands started shaking before his mind fully processed what he was reading. The deed to the property at 42 Maple Lane, transferred not to Charles Crane Jr., Russell's father, but to Nolan Russell Crane upon his 25th birthday. Russell read it again. Then a third time. The words didn't change. His grandfather had left the house to Nolan, not to Russell, not even to Russell's father. Directly to Nolan, his great-grandson, with provisions that the property would be held in trust until Nolan turned 25. Russell sank into a chair, the deed still in his hands. Nolan had turned 25 2 years ago. The house had been legally his for 2 years, and he'd never known it. And Russell had been restoring property that didn't belong to him, that had never been intended for him. The implications cascaded through his mind like falling dominoes. He'd assumed the house had passed to his father, then been abandoned when his father died. He'd assumed that by clearing the back taxes and liens, he was reclaiming family property. But the house had never been his to reclaim. His grandfather had bypassed an entire generation, had bypassed Russell entirely, to ensure his legacy went directly to Nolan. Russell stood up and paced the kitchen, the deed clutched in his hand. Why would his grandfather do this? The answer came quickly, and it hurt like a physical blow. Because even back in 1998, even before Russell had completely fallen apart, his grandfather had seen the weakness in him, had seen that Russell was unreliable, that he wouldn't honor the responsibility of maintaining the family home. So he'd protected it. He'd made sure it went to someone who might actually care for it properly. Russell picked up his phone and called the county clerk's office. The woman who answered listened to his stumbling explanation, then put him on hold. 10 minutes later, she came back with confirmation. The property had been transferred to Nolan Russell Crane upon his 25th birthday, as stipulated in the will. However, Nolan had never been located to be informed of the transfer. The executor, a lawyer who had since retired, had made attempts to find him but had been unsuccessful. "So legally," Russell said, his voice hoarse, "the house belongs to my son." "Yes, sir. Though the back taxes and liens you paid have been credited to the property. When your son does take possession, those obligations will be cleared." Russell thanked her and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table as the afternoon light faded, staring at the deed. Everything he'd done for the past 4 months, every board replaced, every wall repaired, every hour of labor, he'd done to a house that wasn't his, that his grandfather had specifically chosen not to give him. The rejection hurt more than he'd expected. He'd thought he was reclaiming his past, redeeming his family legacy. But his grandfather had already passed that legacy forward, over Russell's head, to someone more worthy. And that someone was Nolan. Russell spent a sleepless night wrestling with what to do. His first impulse was shame. He'd been trespassing, essentially, working on property that didn't belong to him. His second impulse was to leave, to disappear again, before anyone could accuse him of overstepping. But by morning, a different understanding had settled in. His grandfather hadn't given him the house because Russell hadn't earned it. But maybe Russell could earn the right to give it to Nolan properly, not as an inheritance, but as a gift, as proof of change, He pulled out his laptop and drafted an email. This one took hours to write, each word chosen with care. "Nolan, I've discovered something I need to tell you. In your great-grandfather's will, he left the house on Maple Lane to you, not to me. You became the legal owner when you turned 25. I didn't know this when I started working on the house. The county tried to find you to inform you, but they couldn't locate you. I've been restoring property that legally belongs to you. I've paid off the back taxes and liens. That was my choice, and I don't expect to be repaid. But you should know that this house is yours. It was always meant to be yours. I'm going to finish the restoration. Not because I have any claim to the property, but because you deserve to inherit something whole, something cared for. Your great-grandfather wanted you to have a connection to your family history, and I'm going to make sure that connection is strong and true. When the house is finished, I'll send you all the documents. You can decide what to do with it. Keep it, sell it, whatever you want. It's your choice. It's your inheritance. I hope this doesn't upset you. I hope you understand that I'm doing this not to claim anything for myself, but to give you something I should have given you a long time ago. Reliability, commitment, follow-through. Love, Dad. He read it over a dozen times before sending it. Then he went back to work. The discovery had changed something fundamental. Russell was no longer restoring his family home. He was preparing a gift for his son. Everything he did now was for Nolan. Every careful measurement, every properly set nail, every detail attended to with precision. It transformed the work from redemption into service. And somehow that felt right. That felt like what he should have been doing all along. Not trying to reclaim what he'd lost, but trying to give something of value to the person he'd failed. Mrs. Pemberton came by that evening and found Russell working by lamplight in the upstairs hallway. He told her what he'd discovered. She listened quietly, then nodded. "Your grandfather was a wise man," she said. "He knew Nolan would need roots someday, and he knew you'd need a purpose." She looked around at the restored walls, the refinished floors. "Looks like he was right about both things." "I don't deserve this house," Russell said. "No one deserves anything," Mrs. Pemberton replied. "We're given what we're given, and we do what we can with it. You're doing good work here, Russell. Whether the house is yours or Nolan's doesn't change that." After she left, Russell stood in the hallway and looked at the growth chart on the doorframe, still preserved behind its protective plastic. 3 generations of Cranes connected by this house. His grandfather who built it, Russell who abandoned it, and Nolan who would inherit it. Maybe that was the point. Maybe Russell's role in the story was never to possess the house, but to be the bridge between generations. The one who brought it back from the edge so it could pass forward intact. He could live with that. He could build toward that. February arrived with a false promise of spring, a week of warm weather that melted the snow and coaxed early crocuses from the ground. Russell used the break in the cold to tackle the exterior work. The porch needed complete rebuilding in places, and the siding required attention before he could paint. Kyle brought friends from the community college where he was taking classes. They descended on the house on a Saturday morning, 5 young people with energy and goodwill, ready to help. Russell directed them with the kind of patience he'd learned from his own father, showing them how to measure properly, how to cut safely, how to check their work before securing anything permanently. By evening, the porch was structurally sound, for the first time in decades. They stood back and looked at their work, and Russell felt something he hadn't felt in years, pride mixed with gratitude. These young people had given him their Saturday, had trusted his instruction, had helped him build something good. "Same time next weekend?" Kyle asked. "If you're willing," Russell replied. "We're willing." This is actually pretty cool, seeing something come together like this. After they left, Russell sat on the newly repaired porch and thought about community, about how healing happens not just in isolation but in connection. He'd spent so many years alone, convinced he had to fix himself by himself. But maybe that wasn't how it worked. Maybe healing required witnesses, helpers, people who showed up even when you didn't deserve their kindness. The next morning, Russell's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Unknown number, probably spam. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Crane?" This is Patricia Wells from Hartfield and Associates in Portland. I'm calling on behalf of Nolan Crane. Russell's heart stopped. Yes, Mr. Crane, Nolan, received your recent email regarding the property on Maple Lane. He's asked me to handle the legal aspects of the property transfer. He wanted you to know that he appreciates what you've done, and he'd like the restoration to continue. Russell's hand trembled on the phone. He wants me to keep working. Yes, he's asked that we set up an account to cover materials and any help you might need to hire. He doesn't want you to have to pay for the restoration out of pocket. I don't need his money, Russell said quickly. I'm doing this because I want to. He anticipated you might say that. Patricia's voice was kind. He said to tell you that the house belongs to him, which means the responsibility for its upkeep belongs to him. He wants to do this properly. He'd consider it a favor if you'd accept the help. Russell was quiet for a long moment. Did he say anything else? He said to tell you he's following the progress. And that, she paused as if checking her notes, that he appreciates you staying. After the call ended, Russell sat on the porch for an hour, the phone in his hand. Nolan was following the progress. Nolan had hired a lawyer to handle the property properly. Nolan had offered to pay for materials. And most importantly, Nolan wanted him to continue. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was acknowledgement. It was engagement. It was Nolan choosing not to shut Russell out completely. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. That evening, Russell began planning the final phase of the restoration. He made lists, drew sketches, calculated costs. The interior was mostly complete. Walls repaired, floors refinished, systems updated. But the house needed soul. It needed the details that would make it a home rather than just a structure. He decided to build something special for the living room, a piece of carved woodwork that would serve as the centerpiece. Russell had always been good with detail work, and he still had his father's old chisels in the workshop. He sketched out a design, a wooden frame with hand-carved letters, a quote that felt true to what the house represented. A house is made of walls and beams. A home is built with love and dreams. He'd seen the phrase in one of his grandfather's old carpentry books. It felt right for this house, for this moment. Russell bought a piece of cherry wood from Bert's store and began the painstaking work of carving each letter by hand. The work took weeks. Every evening after the day's construction was done, Russell would sit at his makeshift workbench and carve. The physical act was meditative, each careful cut, each smooth stroke of the chisel. The wood gradually revealed the letters, and the letters gradually formed words, and the words held meaning that Russell hoped his son would someday understand. Sheriff Macklin stopped by one evening and watched Russell work. "That's fine craftsmanship," he said. "Your father would be proud. He'd probably say I'm taking too long," Russell replied, not looking up from the wood. "Maybe. Or maybe he'd say you're finally taking the time things deserve." In early March, Kyle arrived with news. "My grandmother told me to tell you. She saw Nolan's mother in town yesterday. Diane. She was at the diner." Russell's hands stilled on the carving. "Diane was here? In Millhaven?" "Just passing through, apparently. But Grandma said she asked about you, about how the house was coming along." Russell set down his tools. Diane had been in town, had driven through at least. That meant she'd been curious enough to see for herself. And his heart jumped at the thought. Maybe Nolan had asked her to check on things. Either way, people were paying attention. People were watching to see if he'd really stay, if he'd really finish what he started. The next Saturday, the volunteer crew returned, expanded now to include 7 people. They painted the exterior, cleaned the yard, planted early bulbs that Mrs. Pemberton donated from her garden. The house began to look like something living again, something cared for. Neighbors walking by would stop and comment on the progress. A few offered materials, leftover paint, extra lumber, plants for the garden. Russell accepted their gifts with gratitude, understanding that this was how communities worked. You gave what you could, you received what you needed, and in the exchange, something larger than individual effort was created. By late March, the house was nearly complete. Russell installed the carved wooden piece above the fireplace mantel, stepping back to admire how the letters caught the light. The growth chart door frame had been carefully incorporated into the new upstairs hallway, preserved and honored. His father's mason jar of nails sat on the mantel, a reminder of inherited wisdom and careful planning. Russell wrote one more letter to Nolan. The house is almost finished. I'm installing the last details now, light fixtures, cabinet hardware, the small things that make a space feel complete. I built something for the living room, a carved piece I hope you'll like. I've been thinking about what makes a house a home. I think it's not the structure itself, but the care that goes into it. The attention? The intention. I hope when you see this house, you'll feel the care I've put into every inch of it. Not because I'm trying to earn forgiveness. I know that's not something I can build. But because you deserve to have something solid, something lasting, something that was made for you with love. The house will be ready soon. Whenever you want to see it, it's waiting for you. Love, Dad. He mailed the letter and went back to work. There were still finishing touches to complete, still details to attend to. But the end was in sight, and with it the moment of truth. Would Nolan come? Would he want to see what his father had built? Russell didn't know. But the house would be ready. He would be ready. Whatever happened next, he'd done everything he could. Spring came fully in April, transforming the yard from bare earth to green possibility. Russell planted a garden along the south side of the house. Tomatoes, beans, peppers, herbs, thinking of future harvests that Nolan might enjoy someday. Or maybe not. But the act of planting felt important anyway, a statement of faith in continuity. The house was complete now, or as complete as Russell could make it alone. Every room had been restored, with careful attention to both historical integrity and modern livability. The plumbing worked. The electrical was up to code. The roof was sound. The windows sealed tight against the weather. The floors gleamed with their original finish, dark oak that had aged into deep honey tones. Russell had furnished it simply, using pieces from the local thrift store and some items Mrs. Pemberton's family no longer needed. A sofa in the living room, a table with 4 chairs in the kitchen, beds in 2 of the upstairs bedrooms. Nothing fancy, but everything solid and serviceable. The house felt ready for living, ready for someone to walk in and make it their own. On a warm evening in late September, exactly 1 year after Russell had first arrived in Millhaven, he stood on the front porch and surveyed his work. The ivy had been cleared from the walls. The siding had been repaired and painted a soft grey-blue that matched the original color he'd found beneath the layers. The porch no longer sagged. The windows caught the sunset and glowed warm. The garden had flourished through summer, and now in early fall, tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. It looked like a home. It looked like a place where someone could be happy. Russell had installed new porch lights the day before, simple fixtures with warm LED bulbs that cast a welcoming glow. He'd never turned them on, wanting to save that moment. Now, as twilight gathered, he flipped the switch. Lights spilled across the porch and down into the yard, reaching toward the road like an invitation. Russell stood in that pool of light and felt something shift in his chest. He'd done it. After a year of work, after countless hours of labor, after pouring everything he had into this project, he'd done it. He'd built something lasting, something good. Whether Nolan ever saw it or not, the work itself had meaning. It had changed Russell in ways he was still discovering. It had taught him patience and precision. It had reconnected him to skills and values he'd abandoned. It had shown him that he was capable of commitment, of seeing something through to completion. Russell sat on the porch swing, another addition he'd built and hung just last week, and rocked gently, listening to the evening sounds of the town. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere music played, somewhere families were sitting down to dinner together. He pulled out his phone and looked at it for a long moment. Then he opened his email and composed one final message to Nolan. The house is finished. The porch light is on. Whenever you're ready, you're welcome home. He hit send before he could second-guess the words. Then he put the phone away and closed his eyes, just breathing in the evening air, feeling the satisfaction of work completed. The sound of a car engine made him open his eyes. Headlights were coming down Maple Lane, moving slowly. Russell's heart rate picked up. It was probably just someone turning around or a neighbor coming home late. But the car slowed further as it approached the house, then pulled to a stop at the gate. Russell stood up, his hands gripping the porch railing. In the darkness, beyond the reach of the porch light, he couldn't see clearly. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the car's interior light. Tall, lean, moving with careful deliberation toward the gate. Russell's breath caught. He knew that walk. Hadn't seen it in 5 years, but he knew it. The way Nolan carried himself, the particular rhythm of his stride. The figure opened the gate and stepped into the yard. The porch light caught him now, illuminating features that were achingly familiar. Nolan was older, of course. His face had lost the last softness of youth, had settled into the angles of manhood. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder. He walked slowly up the path Russell had cleared, his eyes moving over the restored house, taking in every detail. When he reached the porch steps, he stopped and looked up. Father and son locked eyes across the space of a few feet and 5 years of silence. Russell wanted to speak, wanted to say something that would bridge the distance, but his throat had closed around the words. All he could do was stand there, hands trembling on the railing, and look at his son. Nolan's expression was unreadable. Not hostile, but not warm either. Guarded, careful. The face of someone who'd been hurt and learned to protect himself. "I got your email," Nolan said finally. His voice was deeper than Russell remembered, steadier. "All of them," Russell managed to nod. "Thank you for coming." Nolan looked at the house again, his gaze traveling over the fresh paint, the level porch, the glowing windows. "Patricia, my lawyer, she's been sending me photos. Progress reports," he paused. "But I wanted to see it myself." "It's yours," Russell said, his voice rough. "It's all yours. I wanted to make sure it was ready for you." Nolan climbed the first porch step, then the second. Now he was close enough that Russell could see the details, the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his hands curled into loose fists at his sides. Nervous, uncertain. But here, he was here. "Mom told me about Grandpa's will," Nolan said. "That he left this place to me. He wanted you to have roots," Russell replied. "Wanted you to have something solid, and you've been working on it for a year. Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Russell thought about all the reasons, guilt, love, regret, hope. But in the end, the answer was simple. "Because it's what I should have done for you all along," he said quietly. "Built you something that lasts. Something you could depend on." Nolan's jaw tightened. For a moment, Russell thought he might turn around and leave. But instead, Nolan climbed the last step onto the porch. He stood an arm's length away, close enough that Russell could have reached out and touched him, though he didn't dare. "I've been angry at you for a long time," Nolan said. His voice was steady, but Russell could hear the emotion underneath. "Really angry?" "For years." "I know," Russell said. "You have every right to be. I'm still angry." Nolan's eyes met his. "But I'm also—" He stopped, took a breath. "I'm also curious about this, about you. About whether this time is really different." Russell felt tears sting his eyes. He blinked them back. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I can promise I'm not going anywhere. This time I'm staying." Nolan looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Truth maybe, sincerity, some sign that the words were real. "Can I see inside?" Nolan asked finally, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. Russell nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He walked to the front door, the original door, refinished and rehung, and opened it wide, gesturing for Nolan to enter first. His son stepped across the threshold into the house that was his inheritance, his birthright, his connection to generations past. And Russell followed, watching Nolan's face as he took in the restored rooms, the careful details, the evidence of a year's worth of labor and love. Nolan moved through the house slowly, touching things, the refinished banister, the smooth plaster walls, the mantel above the fireplace. His fingers traced the carved words Russell had spent weeks creating. "A house is made of walls and beams." A home is built with love and dreams. You made this? Nolan asked. I did. Used Grandpa's old chisels. They were still sharp. Nolan looked at the mason jar of sorted nails, at the photograph of Russell and his father on the porch. His eyes lingered on each artifact, reading the story they told. Then he noticed the growth chart doorframe in the hallway and walked toward it. Russell watched as his son examined the pencil marks, the dates, the measurements of a childhood Russell had only heard about secondhand. That's you, Nolan said, pointing to the marks. Your heights as a kid. My grandfather measured me every birthday. Stopped when I was 12, when he died. Nolan was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He held it up, and Russell's breath caught. The compass. The old brass compass Russell had found buried in the yard. I've been carrying this for 19 years, Nolan said, his voice thick with emotion. Since I was 8 years old. You gave it to me for my birthday and told me it would always help me find my way home. Russell's hands trembled. I found it in the yard. I thought you'd lost it. I did lose it. When Mom brought me to visit Great-Grandpa when I was 10. It fell out of my pocket somewhere in the yard. Nolan turned the compass over in his hands. But before I lost it, I carried it everywhere. Even after you left. Even after I decided I didn't want to see you anymore. I kept it because his voice broke. Because part of me still remembered when you were a good dad, when you showed up, when you taught me things. Tears were streaming down Russell's face now. He didn't try to hide them. I'm so sorry, Nolan, for all of it. For leaving. For the drinking. For missing so much of your life. Nolan's own eyes were wet. I know you are. I've known for a while. Mom told me about the AA meetings, about you getting sober. But knowing you're sorry and trusting you again, those are different things. I understand that. Do you? Nolan's voice rose slightly. Do you understand what it was like? Waiting for you to show up at games you promised to attend, making excuses to my friends about why my dad wasn't there, graduating college and scanning the crowd, hoping maybe this time you'd surprise me, even though I knew you wouldn't. Russell absorbed each word like a physical blow. No, I can't fully understand. But I know I failed you in every way that matters. You did. Nolan wiped his eyes roughly. You absolutely did. And I've spent years being angry about it, and then trying not to be angry about it, and then feeling guilty for still being angry about it. He looked around the restored house. And then you show up here and do this. Spend a year working on a house that isn't even yours. Pay off debts you didn't have to pay. Build something. His voice broke again. Build something beautiful for me. Russell took a shaky breath. The house is yours. It was always meant to be yours. Your great-grandfather wanted you to have roots, to have a connection to family. I'm just trying to make sure that connection is strong enough to hold. Nolan stepped forward and pressed the compass into Russell's hand. I want you to have this back. No, it's yours. I gave it to you. I know. And I kept it. All these years, even when I was furious with you, I kept it. Nolan's hand closed over Russell's, holding the compass between them. But I don't need it to find my way home anymore. Because you built one. You've actually stayed in one place and built something solid, and you're still here. You're really still here. Russell looked at his son, at the man he'd become despite Russell's absence. Strong, successful, whole. I'm staying, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I promise you I'm staying. I can't promise I'll forget the past, Nolan said, his voice steadying. Or that I'm ready to just pick up like nothing happened. But maybe we can start building something new. Something that's ours, not just echoes of what should have been. That's all I can ask for, Russell said. That's more than I deserve. Probably, Nolan agreed, but there was the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is whether we want to try. I want to try, Russell said. More than anything. Nolan was quiet for a moment, looking down at the compass in his father's hand. I've been thinking about taking a job in Seattle. There's a firm there that does the kind of work I'm interested in. It would be closer to here, closer to Millhaven. Russell's heart leaped, but he kept his voice careful. That would be good, if it's what you want. Not just because of you, Nolan interrupted, but not entirely separate from you either. I want to be close enough to see if this is real. If you really are staying. If we really can build something that works." "We can," Russell said. "I'll do whatever it takes. I know you will. Right now, at least, I believe you." Nolan took a deep breath. "I'm going to stay the weekend. See the town. Meet some of the people who've been helping you. If that's okay." "More than okay," Russell managed. "There's a bed upstairs. Your room, if you want it." Nolan nodded, then seemed to make a decision. He stepped forward, and after a moment's hesitation, embraced his father. It was brief, careful, still carrying the weight of years of hurt. But it was real. Russell held his son, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of his presence. When they stepped apart, both were crying openly. "Thank you," Nolan said quietly. "For the house. For staying. For trying." "Thank you for coming," Russell replied. "For giving me a chance." They stood in the restored hallway, in the house that connected 3 generations, with the compass between them and the porch light glowing warm outside. It wasn't everything. It wasn't complete forgiveness or perfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. It was a foundation on which something new might be built, and for now that was enough. The weekend stretched into Sunday evening, and Nolan showed no signs of rushing away. They'd spent Saturday walking through town, Russell introducing his son to the people who'd become part of his life over the past year. Mrs. Pemberton had insisted they come for lunch, and Kyle had stopped by with his friends to meet the person they'd been helping restore a home for. Nolan had been quiet but present, shaking hands, asking questions about the restoration, listening to stories about Russell's year in Millhaven. Russell watched his son, taking it all in, seeing the evidence of changed behavior through the eyes of people who had no reason to lie about it. On Sunday morning, they sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, a comfortable silence settling between them. Nolan traced the grain of the wood with his finger, and Russell noticed for the first time that his son had his grandfather's hands, long fingers, capable and strong. "Tell me about him," Nolan said suddenly. "About great-grandpa, about why he built this house." So Russell told him. About his grandfather coming home from the war in 1946, marrying his grandmother, buying this land at the edge of town. About how he'd built the house himself over 2 years, working every evening after his shifts at the mill. About the care he'd taken with every joint, every board, every detail. About the pride he'd felt when he finally carried his bride over the threshold. He wanted it to last, Russell said. Wanted to build something that would stand for generations. Something his children and grandchildren could come home to. And then it sat empty for 20 years, Nolan said. "Yes, because I wasn't ready to honor what he'd built. Wasn't capable of it." Russell met his son's eyes. "But you are. You've built a good life, Nolan. You've become someone he'd be proud of." "I'd like to think so." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to keep the house. Not sell it. I think I want to come back here sometimes. Maybe spend summers here or long weekends. Maybe eventually make it my primary home." Russell's throat tightened. "That would be good. And I'd like—" Nolan hesitated. "If you're really staying, if this is really your home now, I'd like you to live here. Take care of it when I'm not here. Make it your home, too." Russell stared at his son, unable to speak for a moment. "You'd trust me with that?" "I'm choosing to trust you with that," Nolan corrected. "There's a difference. Trust isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you build day by day." "I understand. Do you?" Nolan's gaze was steady. "Because if you disappear again, if you fall back into old patterns, I won't give you another chance. I can't. This is it, Dad. This is the one opportunity to build something real between us." "I know," Russell said. "And I won't waste it. I promise you." They decided to mark the moment, the beginning of this new chapter. Nolan suggested they install a new growth chart, a fresh doorframe in the kitchen where they could mark not just heights, but moments. Russell agreed, and they went to Bert's hardware store together, picking out wood and discussing the best placement. That afternoon they installed the frame and carved the first mark. Nolan, age 27, coming home, with the date beside it. It wasn't a height measurement, but it was a beginning. A record that this moment had happened, that they'd been here together, that something new had started. Mrs. Pemberton and Sheriff Macklin joined them for dinner that evening, along with Kyle and his grandmother. They gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where Russell had eaten so many solitary meals over the past year, and shared food and stories. Nolan fit easily into the group, his architect's eye appreciating the restoration details, his questions drawing out the neighbors who'd become Russell's family. Russell watched from his seat, hardly able to believe this was real. His son, in this house, laughing at one of Sheriff Macklin's stories. His son, accepting a second helping from Mrs. Pemberton. His son here. After everyone left, Russell and Nolan sat on the porch as the sun set. The September air was cooling, carrying the first hint of the autumn to come. The garden Russell had planted was heavy with late tomatoes. The porch light glowed steady and warm. "I have to head back tomorrow," Nolan said. "I work on Monday. But I'll come back, maybe in a few weeks for Thanksgiving." "I'll be here," Russell said. "I'll always be here." Nolan nodded, then stood and stretched. "I'm going to turn in. It's been a long weekend." "Good night, son." Nolan paused at the door, turned back. "Good night, Dad." The word "Dad" settled into Russell's chest like something precious finding its home. He sat on the porch, long after Nolan had gone inside, looking at the house that glowed with light and life, listening to the sounds of someone moving around in the upstairs bedroom, knowing his son was safe and close and here. Sometimes the longest journeys are the ones that lead us home, not to a place, but to the people we love. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we get the chance to rebuild what we thought was lost forever. Russell had built a house, yes, but more importantly, he'd built a foundation for forgiveness, one board, one day, one honest moment at a time. The porch light glowed warm against the gathering darkness, and Russell knew this was just the beginning. There would be more work ahead, more trust to build, more moments to create. But the foundation was solid now. The house was standing, and both father and son had found their way home.